there lived a king whose name was Sir Orpheo. His people loved him, not only because he was a good king, but because he played the harp. And he played it so marvelously that men journeyed from far and wide, and women too, to sit down at the table in his great hall and listen for hours into the night. When he played, the trees came down to listen to him. The rivers and the streams would stand still when he played. Even the stags and the dogs hunting them in the forest would stop frozen in their pursuit and all cock their heads and listen to the sound of the harp. I love this as much as you do right now. I'm assuming you love it. So Orpheo had a wife whose name was Herodites, and he loved her more than anything in the world. One day, the lady Herodites went for a walk. With her maidens around her, she went out into the orchard, and she sat under an apple tree in the orchard. And there, under the midday sun, she fell asleep. Her maidens put their hands to their lips and cocked their heads, and all were in a dreamy slumber. Suddenly, Herodites stood up with a wild shriek, and she ran out of the orchard and into the castle. Her maidens leapt to their feet, and they pursued her all the way up into her bedchamber. Someone rushed to fetch Sir Orpheo, who came running like the wind. At the sight of him, Herodites grew quiet, though she was still weeping bitterly. "What troubles you, my love?" said Sir Orpheo. "When I slept, I saw a grim king. A grim king appeared to me, with a train of knights and ladies behind him. And he asked me to go with him into his kingdom, where there are cities and towers, rivers and forests and fields of flowers. I would not go with him, and I told him as much. But he vowed that tomorrow he would come and find me and take me with him, whether an entire army of soldiers was stood guard over me. Oh, my love, I must leave you. There's no help for it." "How can we be parted?" said Sir Orpheo. "We have not been separated since we were betrothed." "I will wait for this king with all my army." The next day at noon, Sir Orpheo waited under the apple tree, holding Herodites by the hand. Around them, standing shoulder to shoulder and facing outwards with drawn swords, was Sir Orpheo's army. As the sun stood overhead, Herodites vanished from in and amongst them. So Orpheo sought out his oldest counsellor And he said to him, I will not stay here any longer. I give the kingdom into your charge. When you hear that I am dead, choose another king. Rule well and do not weep for me. Then he left the city, barefoot and wearing ragged clothes, and carrying his harp. He went up into the moors, onto the bare heath, and he lived there, with only little snakes and the birds and briars for company. He ate the herbs and the roots, and slept among the rocks in the wind and the rain. Sometimes, when the mists drove over the moors, he thought he heard the sounds of a battle being fought. Shouts and the clamour of weapons, and the dim blowing of a horn. But he never saw anything. Then one hot day in summer, a great hunt went by him, and he ran after it, laughing because he thought he was in a mad dream. No one ever hunted up there on the lonely moors. There were many ladies, all in white, each lady carrying a white hawk on her wrist and riding a white horse. The last one looked back at him, and it was Herodites. Neither of them spoke, but the tears fell from her eyes to see him looking so ragged, so starved and wild, he who had been such a great king. Then the whole throng swept on and vanished through a huge door that opened in the side of a tor. It closed behind them, so Orpheo flung himself against it, and he beat on it with his fists, crying, "Let me in! Let me in! I'm a minstrel! Let me play my harp before the grim king!" The door opened. And so Orpheo found himself in a strange country, flat as a chessboard, with cities and towers, rivers and forests, and fields of flowers. The sky was gold all over and shone dully, and there were no shadows. He came to the castle of the grim king, and the courtyard was full of people, but they were silent and did not move, for they were in an enchanted sleep. So Orpheo went into the king's hall. The king was seated on a silver throne, wearing a crown neither of gold nor of silver, but wrought out of a single jewel. His court were all about him. They had all been stolen away from our world, and Herodites was among them. So Orpheo stood before the grim king, and he played his harp. And the court fell silent. The sleepers outside came gliding across the courtyard to listen, their still faces staring in at the windows. The king turned his head towards Sir Orpheo, as if compelled. He too was spellbound by the music. "What can I give you?" he said. "How can I reward such a minstrel?" "Anything you ask, I will give you." "Give me Herodites," said Sir Orpheo. "Herodites!" "She is one of my people now," said the grim king. "You've promised," said Sir Orpheo. "Is this the word of the promise of a great king?" "I have promised," said the king. "Take her then, and go." So Orpheo took Herodites by the hand and led her out of the strange country, back to his own little kingdom. But neither of them knew what had been happening in Sir Orpheo's kingdom while he had been away. Whether the oldest counsellor had despaired of Sir Orpheo's life and chosen a new king, or even seized the throne for himself. Being so unsure of their welcome, they were glad that when they returned, no one recognized them. So Orpheo still looked like a beggar, and Herodites drew her hood over her face. They went to the great hall where the councillors were feasting and asked for food. The oldest counsellor had them fed, but when he saw Sir Orpheo's harp, he knew whose it was, and he said, "Beggar, where did you find that harp?" So Orpheo said, "I found it beside the bones of a man torn apart by wild beasts." All the councillors, grief-stricken, hid their faces. "Ah!" "But he has come to life again." And Sir Orpheo took up his harp and played once again. Herodites drew back the hood from her face. One by one, the councillors looked up and observed and saw, they recognized them. The table was overturned as they ran out into the streets, shouting the good news all over the city. And the citizens wept for gladness. So Orpheo and the lady Herodites lived well and happily for many years to come, and the kingdom was ruled wisely. And well. I just want to explain that this came to me as the appropriate story, and it's a gorgeous, authentic medieval rendition of the Greek myth of Orpheus. And I knew I couldn't do it better justice by learning it than by reading it. So it's quite unconventional to read it. And because he plays the harp, I asked our tribe, our community, if anyone had a harp. And earlier this week, I was given this harp. So thank you for entertaining a more unorthodox version of this telling, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
One more.